What if I told you that a loveless marriage could turn into the most intense passion of all? A 23-year-old woman is forced to marry a millionaire businessman she barely knows, but what seemed like a mere family arrangement will become one of the most breathtaking love stories you've ever heard. Where are you watching us from? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if you want to discover how destiny brought two hearts together. The mirror reflected an image that Emily barely recognized. Her trembling hands adjusted the bridal veil for the 10th time as she observed her reflection with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. At 23, she was about to marry a stranger. Sometimes fate places us on paths we would never have chosen, but which might be exactly the ones we need to travel. Emily Parker belonged to one of the most traditional families in New York, although appearances concealed an increasingly precarious financial reality. The white dress that now embraced her delicate figure represented not so much a choice as a desperate solution to the economic problems threatening to sink her family. "Ah, you look beautiful, darling," whispered her mother, entering the room with eyes reddened from contained tears. "James is a respectable man. With time, you'll learn to care for him." Emily nodded mechanically, though inside she was churning with contradictory emotions. How does one learn to care for someone they've barely seen 3 times? The 3 occasions had been formal meetings, measured conversations, and protocol smiles. James Mitchell, at 32, was a legend in New York's business world. Disciplined, relentless, and absolutely focused on expanding the empire his father had built. Miles away, in the majestic Mitchell estate in Connecticut, James observed the tropical rain that began to fall on the gardens. His impassive expression perfectly concealed his thoughts, while Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper who had watched him grow up, adjusted his tuxedo tie. "Your father would be proud, Mr. James," commented the woman with the familiarity that only decades of service could permit. "This is a business arrangement, Mrs. Wilson, not a love story," he responded with a deep, controlled voice. "The Parkers need capital, and I need to fulfill my father's last wishes before completely taking control of the companies." However, for a fleeting moment, a shadow of doubt crossed his dark eyes. Was this what he really wanted for his life? An arranged marriage like those from centuries past? But James Mitchell hadn't reached where he was by questioning decisions already made. With a firm movement, he buttoned his jacket and turned away from the mirror, ready to sign the most important contract of his life. St. Patrick's Cathedral, imposing with its Gothic architecture, hosted a ceremony that proceeded in a silence interrupted only by the whispers of guests. When they finally met at the altar, Emily timidly raised her gaze to meet the penetrating eyes of her future husband. For a second, she thought she saw something more than coldness in them, something like curiosity or perhaps surprise. But it was so fleeting that she might have imagined it. Their vows sounded hollow, borrowed words that reflected no real feeling. When their lips met in a protocol kiss that sealed the agreement, both felt an inexplicable shiver run through their bodies. Perhaps it was just nervousness, or maybe, though neither dared to consider it, the prelude to something neither had foreseen in their carefully laid plans. The imposing Mitchell estate stood as a monument to generations of power and tradition. For Emily, who had grown up in a traditional but modest house in Brooklyn, the wide corridors decorated with antique furnishings and the inner courtyards where fountain water sang day and night were as intimidating as they were fascinating. "Your room is ready, Mrs. Mitchell," announced Mrs. Wilson with a kind smile, guiding her through a corridor flanked by century-old arches. "Mr. James has given instructions for you to feel comfortable." The room was a spacious and bright space, with large windows overlooking a garden of magnolias and maple trees. A 4-poster bed occupied the center, so large that Emily thought she might get lost in it. Everything was decorated with exquisite taste, but also with an impersonality that revealed the hand of a professional decorator, not that of her now husband. "Mr. James usually has breakfast at 7 sharp, continued Mrs. Wilson, showing her the closet where her clothes had already been carefully placed. "He leaves early for the offices and returns for dinner, generally at 8. Emily nodded, absorbing the information like someone studying the rules of an unknown game. She didn't ask where James would sleep, and Mrs. Wilson didn't offer that information. The wedding party had been brief and formal, allowing them to return early to the estate. Now, alone in that unfamiliar room, Emily allowed herself for the first time since the day began to let out the tears she had contained. The first days followed a predictable pattern. James religiously adhered to the schedule described by Mrs. Wilson, though he frequently called to advise he would be late for dinner. Their conversations were polite but distant, limited to courteous questions about her comfort or practical needs. "Are you finding everything to your liking?" he asked one night, while they shared an elaborate dinner in a dining room designed for 20 people. "Everything is perfect, thank you," she responded automatically, with her eyes fixed on her plate. An uncomfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the soft tinkling of silverware. Emily gathered courage and added, "The gardens are especially beautiful. I spent the afternoon exploring them." Something in James's gaze changed subtly, as if a curtain had been partially opened for an instant. "My mother designed them," he commented in a different, almost soft voice. "Especially the rose garden. It was her favorite place." It was the first personal information he had voluntarily shared, and Emily received it like a small treasure. "You must have loved her very much," she ventured to suggest. James seemed to tense instantly, and the invisible curtain closed again. "She died when I was 7, he responded curtly, returning to his coffee. "Tomorrow I have to leave early for Chicago. I'll return on Friday." And so the moment of connection vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Emily with more questions than answers about the man with whom she had joined her life. The first crack in James Mitchell's perfect facade appeared on an April morning almost 3 months after the wedding. Emily had established her own routine within the immense estate. She had breakfast late, explored the gardens, read in the library, and occasionally visited her family in the city. That day, she had received a letter that would change the dynamic between them. Seated on a stone bench in the rose garden, wearing a light yellow dress that contrasted with the exuberance of the flowers, Emily read with trembling hands the news. Jessica, her best friend since childhood, was moving to London after marrying a British banker. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks as she absorbed that one of her last links to her previous life was definitely moving away. "Bad news!" James's deep voice startled her. It was the first time he had appeared at the estate in mid-morning, and his unexpected presence made her feel strangely vulnerable. "My best friend is moving to London," she responded, trying to disguise her sadness. "It's good news for her, of course." James remained standing, observing her with an indecipherable expression. He wore one of his impeccable dark suits, but there was something different in his posture, something less rigid than usual. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," he said finally, turning to leave. "You're not interrupting," Emily hurried to say, surprising herself by wanting to stop him. "It's just that sometimes I miss having someone to talk to." The words escaped her lips before she could contain them, and for an instant she feared she had crossed some invisible line. To her surprise, James sat on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance. "This house has always had too much silence," he commented, looking at the roses. "My father believed that unnecessary words were a waste of time." Emily observed him from the corner of her eye, noticing for the first time small details. A slight wrinkle on his forehead when he mentioned his father. The way his hands, though still on his knees, seemed tense. "And you? Do you believe that too?" she asked, with a courage she didn't know she possessed. James looked at her directly, and Emily felt something stir inside her at the intensity of those dark eyes. "I think there are necessary silences and empty silences," he responded finally. "I've lived too many of the second kind." That confession, though brief, opened a small window to a James Mitchell that Emily hadn't imagined. Before she could respond, he took a linen handkerchief from his pocket and offered it with an elegant gesture. "I'm sorry about your friend," he added, standing up. "If you need to visit her in London sometime, we can arrange it." He left with the same discretion with which he had appeared, leaving Emily with the soft handkerchief between her fingers and a disconcerting sensation in her chest. For the first time since the wedding, she began to wonder who the man she had married really was. The misunderstanding that followed that meeting in the garden took both by surprise. Emily, embarrassed by having shown vulnerability, began to avoid common spaces during the day. James, interpreting this distancing as rejection of his awkward attempt at approach, responded by working longer hours and returning even later to the estate. On a particularly warm afternoon, Mrs. Wilson found Emily in the library, absently leafing through a book of poetry. "Mr. James has called to say he won't be coming for dinner, Mrs. Mitchell," she informed with a concerned expression. "It's the third time this week." Emily nodded without lifting her eyes from the book, though the words on the page had become blurred. "That's all right, Mrs. Wilson. I'll have dinner early then." The older woman remained in the doorway, observing her with eyes that had seen generations of Mitchells grow up. "If I may be so bold, Mrs. Mitchell," she began cautiously, "Mr. James is not a man who knows how to express what he feels. His father raised him to be strong, not to be happy." Emily looked up, surprised by this unexpected confidence. "I don't know what he expects from me, Mrs. Wilson," she finally confessed. "Sometimes I think I'm just part of the furniture in this house." Mrs. Wilson approached and sat across from her, with a familiarity that contradicted the strict rules of service. "When young Master James was little, before the mistress passed away, this house was full of music," she recounted with a nostalgic smile. "The mistress would play the piano in the afternoons, and he would sit beside her, fascinated. Afterward, the master had the music room closed. He said businesses aren't built with sonatas." Emily felt something stir inside her. The closed piano she had seen in one of the rooms in the West Wing now took on new meaning. "Did James play too?" she asked, genuinely interested. "He took lessons, yes, he had talent according to his teacher," responded Mrs. Wilson, standing up. "But that was a long time ago, Mrs. Mitchell. Now, would you prefer dinner served in the small dining room?" That conversation awakened in Emily a curiosity she hadn't felt before. That night, instead of retiring early to her room, she explored the West Wing until she found the music room. It was a spacious room with large windows overlooking the back garden, dominated by a magnificent grand piano covered with a protective cloth. Carefully, she removed the fabric and ran her fingers over the yellowed keys, producing notes that were out of tune from disuse. "My mother used to play Gershwin." James's voice from the doorway startled her. She hadn't heard him arrive. He still wore his office suit, though the tie was loosened, and he carried his jacket on his arm, signs of a long workday. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," Emily began, quickly withdrawing her hands from the instrument. "Don't apologize," he interrupted, approaching slowly. "No one has entered here in years." There was something different in his voice, a cadence less controlled than usual. Emily wondered if he might have been drinking, but when he came close enough, she only perceived the aroma of his usual cologne, mixed with the unmistakable smell of the cigars she had rarely seen him smoke. "Do you play?" he asked, stopping beside the piano without touching the keys. "A little," she confessed. "My grandfather taught me when I was a child. Nothing comparable to Gershwin, I'm afraid." A fleeting smile, almost imperceptible, crossed James's usually serious face. "She would have liked someone to play here again," he commented, more to himself than to Emily. "She always said a house without music is like a garden without flowers." Emily observed him with renewed interest. In that moment, with his guard down and his eyes fixed on the piano, he seemed younger and more vulnerable. "I could try if you'd like," she offered impulsively. "It would need tuning, but—" "I'll arrange it," he interrupted, suddenly returning to his business tone. "I'll send someone tomorrow." There was a silence, not entirely uncomfortable, while both remained beside the instrument. Finally, James added, "I'm sorry I wasn't here for dinner." "There's a lot of work, I understand," she responded with a timid smile. He nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wanted to say more. Instead, he consulted his watch. "It's late. You should rest." Emily nodded and headed toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped, and without turning asked, "Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow? I could ask Mrs. Wilson to prepare something special." There was a moment of silence that seemed eternal to her. "I would like that," James finally responded, with a voice that seemed to come from someone different from the relentless businessman that New York knew. When Emily retired to her room that night, she felt that something had changed between them. It wasn't love, not even friendship, but for the first time since the wedding, she had glimpsed the man behind the mask of perfection that James Mitchell showed to the world. Summer arrived in Connecticut with a scorching heat that transformed the estate's gardens into an oasis of vibrant colors. The months following that encounter in the music room marked the beginning of a subtle but constant transformation in the dynamic between Emily and James. The piano was tuned as he had promised, and soon the notes of simple melodies began to float through the corridors during the afternoons. To Emily's surprise, James began to adjust his schedule to return in time for dinners, which they now regularly shared in the small dining room. a more intimate space where conversations flowed with increasing naturalness. "When did you know you wanted to dedicate yourself to business?" Emily asked one night, while they enjoyed a cheesecake that Mrs. Wilson had specially prepared. James looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something resembling amusement. "Who says I wanted to dedicate myself to business?" he responded, taking a sip of his brandy. Emily blinked, disconcerted. "But you're one of the most successful businessmen in New York. Being good at something doesn't mean it's your passion," he explained, with a trace of bitterness that didn't go unnoticed by her. "My father decided my future when I was 12. He sent me to study in England, at a school where mathematics and economics were more important than art or music." Emily observed him with new eyes, perceiving for the first time the layers of obligations and expectations that had shaped the man before her. "What would you have chosen?" she asked softly. James turned his gaze to the window, where the summer night enveloped the gardens in shadows. "Architecture, perhaps," he finally confessed. "I liked the idea of creating spaces that would endure, that would mean something to the people who inhabited them." A melancholic smile crossed his face as he added, "Ironies of life. Now I build and tear down companies as if they were models." Emily felt a sudden impulse to approach, to touch his hand in a gesture of understanding. She restrained herself, unsure of how such an approach would be received. Instead, she shared something of herself. "I wanted to study art history," she confessed. "I dreamed of working in a museum, surrounded by beauty." James looked at her with renewed interest, as if he were seeing a completely new facet of her. "What stopped you?" Emily slightly shrugged her shoulders, a gesture that James had begun to recognize as a sign of her discomfort. "My family's financial situation," she responded honestly. "My father made some unfortunate investments a few years ago. Appearances were maintained, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. James nodded, perfectly understanding the implications. "And then the marriage proposal appeared," he completed, with an indecipherable expression. "Yes," she confirmed, holding his gaze. "Then you appeared. Something passed between them in that moment, a silent connection based on the mutual recognition that both had sacrificed personal dreams to meet others' expectations." James rose abruptly, breaking the moment. "We could," he began with a hesitation uncharacteristic of him. "If you're interested, we could visit the Metropolitan Museum this weekend. They have a temporary exhibition of 19th century American painting." Emily felt her heart make an unexpected leap. It was the first time he had proposed an activity together outside the estate. "I'd love that," she responded with a genuine smile. That visit to the museum marked a turning point. Under the high ceilings of the exhibition halls, surrounded by canvases that narrated American history, both discovered each other from unexpected angles. Emily revealed a surprising knowledge of pictorial techniques and historical contexts that impressed James. He, in turn, showed an aesthetic sensibility that contradicted his image as an exclusively pragmatic man. "There's something about this painting," James commented, stopping in front of a landscape of the Hudson River Valley, "the way the artist captured the light between the trees. It's as if you could feel the warmth of the sun filtering through the leaves," Emily completed, looking at the work with the same admiration. "That's what I love about art, its capacity to make us feel something that someone felt centuries ago." James observed her as she contemplated the painting, captivated not so much by the art as by the expression of genuine delight on his wife's face. For the first time since he had met her, he allowed himself to recognize that Emily Parker, now Mitchell, possessed a beauty that went far beyond the perfection of her features. There was an inner light, an authenticity in her passion for the things she loved that was inexplicably attractive. Upon leaving the museum, they walked through Central Park in a complicit silence, occasionally sharing observations about what they had seen. When their hands accidentally brushed, neither pulled away immediately. The contact, though brief, sent an electric current through Emily's arm, awakening sensations she had never associated with the man who was now her husband. That night, back at the estate, James stopped in front of Emily's bedroom door. They had maintained separate rooms from the beginning, a tacit agreement that reflected the nature of their marriage. "Thank you for today," he said, with a voice softer than usual. It was revealing. Emily smiled, aware that something important had changed between them. "For me as well," she responded sincerely. "Good night, James." For an instant it seemed he wanted to say something more, perhaps even come closer. Instead he nodded slightly and headed toward his own room. Emily entered her room with her heart beating in a way she couldn't attribute simply to the day's fatigue. As she prepared for bed, she realized she was smiling. For the first time since she had arrived at that house, she felt less like an intruder and more like someone who could eventually find her place. The transformation of their relationship continued throughout the summer, manifesting in small daily gestures. James began to bring art books he thought might interest her. Emily learned to prepare coffee exactly as he liked it. They shared more dinners, more conversations, more comfortable silences. The immense estate, which at first had seemed to Emily like a luxury mausoleum, began to feel like a home. It was in August when a fierce summer storm hit Connecticut, bringing with it violent winds and a downpour that transformed the gardens into small lakes. Emily, who had feared storms since childhood, sought refuge in the library, the place in the house where she felt safest. With a book in her lap that she couldn't read, she jumped at each thunder that shook the huge windows. "Emily?" James's voice from the door surprised her. She hadn't heard him arrive. The roar of the storm had masked the sound of his steps. "I thought you'd be in Boston until tomorrow," she commented, trying to make her voice sound normal despite the trembling in her hands. "I cancelled the meeting when the meteorologist announced the storm," he explained, approaching. "The roads are dangerous." A lightning bolt illuminated the room, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunder. Emily couldn't help a small cry, instinctively closing her eyes. When she opened them, James was beside her, observing her with concern. "You're afraid of them?" he asked softly, without a trace of mockery in his voice. Emily nodded, embarrassed by showing weakness. "Since childhood," she confessed. "It's irrational, I know." "Fears are rarely rational," he responded, sitting in the adjacent armchair. "As a child, I was afraid of the dark. I was convinced there was something lurking in the shadows." The confession, as unexpected as it was moving, made Emily look at him with new eyes. "What did you do?" she asked, genuinely interested. A melancholic smile crossed James's face. "My mother would leave a lamp on," he recalled. "After she died, my father decided it was time to make a man of me. One night he simply closed the door and left me in complete darkness. He said facing fears was the only way to overcome them." Another thunder rumbled, making the glass tremble. Without thinking, Emily reached for James's hand. To her surprise, he intertwined his fingers with hers, offering her an anchor amid the storm. "Did it work?" she asked, referring to his father's method. James looked at her directly, and Emily could see something in his eyes she had never noticed before. Vulnerability. "Not exactly," he admitted. "I learned to live with the darkness, but I never stopped fearing it. I just learned not to show it." Those words resonated with Emily in an unexpected way. Suddenly, many aspects of James's personality made sense. His constant control, his apparent coldness, his difficulty expressing emotions. It wasn't insensitivity, it was armor built since childhood. The storm worsened, and the lights flickered several times before going out completely, plunging the library into a twilight relieved only by occasional lightning. Emily involuntarily squeezed James's hand. "Wait here," he said, gently releasing her. He returned minutes later with several candles that he distributed around the room, creating a warm and almost magical environment. The contrast between the dancing shadows and the fury of the storm on the other side of the windows was strangely comforting. "Better this way, right?" he asked, sitting down beside her again. "Much better," Emily nodded, grateful for the gesture. A comfortable silence settled between them as they listened to the patter of rain against the glass. Without the weight of gazes, protected by the dimness, both found it easier to talk. "You know what's hardest about this marriage?" James suddenly asked, with an honesty that surprised them both. Emily held her breath, unsure if she wanted to hear the answer. "Not knowing what you expect from me," he continued, before she could respond. "Not knowing if you see me as a jailer, a benefactor, or simply as the man you had to marry to save your family." The vulnerability in his voice deeply moved Emily. For the first time, she realized that she wasn't the only one trapped in a situation she hadn't completely chosen. "At first, I saw you as a solution," she confessed, gathering courage to be equally honest. "Then, as a stranger with whom I shared a roof. And now," she stopped, unsure how to express the evolution of her feelings. Now, he insisted, in a whisper barely audible above the noise of the storm. Now, I see you, James, she responded simply. Not the businessman, not the Mitchell name. I see you, and I wonder how much more there is to discover. The look they exchanged then contained more truth than any words they had shared before. In the golden dimness of the candles, with the storm raging outside, both silently acknowledged that something fundamental had changed between them. James raised a hand, doubtful, and gently brushed Emily's cheek. It was a tentative gesture, almost shy, so different from the confidence with which he managed his businesses. She briefly closed her eyes, assimilating the warmth of his touch. When the strongest thunder of the night shook the estate, Emily didn't jump. At some point, without either of them consciously noticing, their fears had taken a back seat, eclipsed by the discovery of something much more powerful that was beginning to grow between them. Autumn brought a different air to the Mitchell estate. After that stormy night, something had definitely changed in the dynamic between Emily and James. Although there had been no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, a new emotional intimacy had been established between them. They shared more time together. Their conversations became deeper, and occasionally, when their hands brushed during dinner or while walking through the gardens, neither rushed to break the contact. One September morning, James entered the breakfast room where Emily was peacefully having her coffee. His expression contained a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that she had never seen on his usually serene face. "Good morning," he greeted, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I have something to propose to you." Emily looked at him with curiosity, noting that he was dressed more casually than usual, linen pants and a blue shirt that highlighted the bronze tone of his skin. "I'm listening," she responded, setting aside the magazine she had been leafing through. "I need to travel to San Francisco for a few days," he explained, sitting across from her. "Meetings with investors, mainly. But I thought that you might accompany me." The proposal, though presented with apparent casualness, had significant weight. It would be the first time they traveled together, the first time they would present themselves as a couple outside the controlled environment of New York. "You want me to accompany you?" Emily asked, seeking to confirm that this wasn't simply courtesy. James looked at her directly, and an almost imperceptible smile softened his features. "I want to share the city with you," he responded with sincerity. "There are places I think you'd like. The Museum of Modern Art, the Golden Gate Park, Alcatraz." Emily felt an unexpected excitement at the prospect. San Francisco had always been a pending destination on her wish list. "I'd love to," she accepted with a genuine smile. "When would we leave?" "Tomorrow, if that suits you," he responded, visibly pleased with her enthusiasm. "I've already asked Mrs. Wilson to prepare your luggage." James's usual efficiency in preparations contrasted with a new element that Emily clearly perceived, an authentic desire to share something with her, not out of obligation, but by choice. The journey in the Mitchell Company's private jet was a new experience for Emily. She observed with fascination the changing landscape through the window, while James discreetly worked on his laptop. Occasionally, he would look up to point out some point of interest or ask if she needed anything. There was a growing naturalness in their interactions that made Emily momentarily forget the strange beginnings of their relationship. The suite at the Fairmont Hotel that James had reserved occupied an entire floor, with large windows offering a panoramic view of the city and the bay. Emily was momentarily speechless at the discreet but omnipresent luxury. "Is it too much?" James asked, observing her reaction. "I could look for something more—" "It's perfect," she interrupted him with a smile. "I just need to get used to all this." He nodded, understanding. Sometimes he forgot the difference between the world in which he had grown up and Emily's. "My first meeting is in 2 hours," he explained, consulting his watch. "But I've arranged something for you in the meantime, if you're interested." Emily looked at him with curiosity. "I've hired a guide to show you the Museum of Modern Art," he continued. "I thought you might like to see the works of Hopper and Pollock without having to wait for me." The gesture, as considerate as it was unexpected, moved Emily. It wasn't just the material generosity that impressed her, but the fact that James had specifically thought about her interests. "Thank you," she responded with sincerity. "But may I propose something different?" James looked at her with interest. "I'd prefer to wait and visit it with you," she explained. "If you don't mind, of course, I can explore the surroundings in the meantime." Something changed in James's expression, a softness he rarely allowed himself to show. "I don't mind at all," he responded, with a voice slightly hoarser than usual. "In fact, I would like that very much." The days in San Francisco passed in a balance between James's professional commitments and shared moments that wove a new intimacy between them. They visited the Museum of Modern Art together, where Emily was moved to tears before the impressive works of American realism. They strolled through Chinatown, discovering small art galleries and traditional cafes. One afternoon was dedicated entirely to the Golden Gate Park, where James surprised Emily with his knowledge of American landscape design. "I didn't know you were so interested in landscaping," she commented, as they observed a particularly beautiful Japanese garden. "My grandfather was fond of the subject," he explained. "As a child, I spent hours listening to him talk about classical gardens and the secrets of Eastern design." Each new revelation, each fragment of his past that James voluntarily shared, brought Emily a little closer to understanding the complex man who was hidden behind the successful businessman. On the night of their penultimate day, James surprised her with a dinner on the hotel terrace, decorated with candles and flowers. A small string ensemble played discreetly, creating an atmosphere that was unequivocally romantic. "This is unexpected," Emily commented, genuinely surprised as he pulled out her chair for her to sit. "I've discovered that I like surprising you," James confessed with a smile that completely transformed his usually serious face. "Your expression when you see something that moves you is—" He stopped, apparently unable to find the right word. "Is," she encouraged him, feeling her heart inexplicably accelerate. "Luminous," he finally completed, as if an inner light were being turned on. Dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of growing intimacy. They talked about everything and nothing, discovering unexpected coincidences in their literary tastes and amusing differences in their opinions about cinema. For the first time since they had known each other, they laughed together with authentic joy, free from the tensions and expectations that had marked the beginning of their relationship. When dessert arrived, accompanied by a bottle of champagne that James had specially selected, Emily realized that she was seeing him with new eyes. He was no longer the distant businessman she had married out of convenience. He was an intelligent, complex man with wounds he tried to hide and a capacity for tenderness that he was just beginning to express. "A toast," he proposed, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." Emily felt that those words contained much more than they appeared to. "To new beginnings," she repeated, holding his gaze as their glasses met with a soft clink. That night after dinner, they walked together along the illuminated Embarcadero. The conversation flowed naturally, interspersed with comfortable silences. When they reached the viewpoint near the Golden Gate Bridge, they stopped to admire the night view of the city, a sea of lights that extended as far as the eye could see. "Thank you for sharing this with me," said Emily, sincerely moved by the beauty of the moment. James looked at her and for the first time didn't hide what he felt. There was desire in his eyes, yes, but also something deeper, more significant. "Emily," he began, with a voice she had never heard from him before. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he leaned in slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished. But Emily didn't move. When their lips met, it wasn't the protocol kiss of their wedding, but a real one, loaded with newly discovered emotions and silent promises. That kiss marked a turning point, the moment when both recognized that what had begun as a convenient arrangement had transformed into something completely different, something neither of them had foreseen, but which now seemed as inevitable as the dawn that was beginning to appear on the horizon of the city. The trip to San Francisco had transformed something fundamental between them. Back at the estate, James and Emily began to share not only time and conversations, but also small gestures of affection that would have been unthinkable before. Hands that sought each other during walks in the garden, stolen kisses in the corridors, complicit glances during dinners. Emily's room, which had been her solitary refuge for months, began to be visited by James at night, not only to share physical intimacy, but also for long conversations under the dim light of the lamps. Sometimes they simply slept embraced, as if they were recovering all the human contact they had both silently yearned for. On a particularly bright morning in October, while they were having breakfast together on the terrace overlooking the maple garden, James's phone rang insistently. The call lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough to transform his expression. When he hung up, his face had recovered that impenetrable mask that Emily had almost forgotten. "Has something happened?" she asked, concerned by the sudden change. James remained silent for a few seconds, as if he were internally debating how much to share. "It was Thompson, my lawyer," he finally responded, with a carefully neutral voice. "There's a matter related to my father's will that requires immediate attention." Emily nodded, waiting for him to continue. When he didn't, an uncomfortable sensation began to form in her stomach. "Can I help in some way?" she offered. James finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that alarmed her, a mixture of guilt and concern that didn't accord with his usual confidence. "I need to go to his office," he responded, standing up. "I'll be back for dinner." He leaned in to kiss her, a gesture that had become natural between them. But this time it was different, briefer, almost distracted. Emily watched him walk away with growing unease, sensing that something important had just changed. The afternoon passed with an exasperating slowness. Emily tried to distract herself with a book, then with the piano, finally with a walk through the gardens, but the anxiety didn't leave her. When she heard the motor of James's car in the driveway, night was already falling. She found him in the library, pouring himself a whiskey with tense movements that revealed his state of mind. Upon seeing her at the door, he tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "James, please," she said directly, "tell me what's happening." He took a long drink before responding, as if seeking courage in the amber liquid. "There's a clause in my father's will that I had forgotten," he began, avoiding looking at her directly. "A condition for inheriting the totality of the Mitchell companies." Emily waited, feeling her heart inexplicably accelerate. "The marriage must produce an heir within 2 years," he finally continued, with a controlled voice. "Or I'll lose 30% of the shares, which would go to my cousin Richard." The revelation fell between them like a stone in a tranquil pond, generating waves of disturbance that threatened to destroy the peace they had built. "An heir?" Emily repeated, trying to process the information. "A child," James nodded, finally looking at her. "Thompson reminded me that there's less than a year left before the deadline," he added. "It's not something I've been keeping track of, honestly. These months with you, especially since we returned from San Francisco, I've thought less and less about the will and the obligations." There was sincerity in his voice, but Emily could barely hear it. A storm of contradictory emotions invaded her. Shock, confusion, and predominantly a sense of betrayal she couldn't repress. "Is that why you married me?" she asked, with a voice she didn't recognize as her own. "To fulfill the clause in the will?" James set the glass on the table with more force than necessary. "At the beginning, yes," he admitted, opting for complete honesty. "I needed to get married. Your family needed financial support. It was a convenient arrangement for both parties." "A convenient arrangement?" she repeated, feeling that each word was a knife. "And now you need a child to complete the deal." "Emily, it's not like that," he protested, approaching her. "What has happened between us these last months has nothing to do with the will. What I feel for you is real." But Emily had instinctively backed away, as if his proximity were painful. "How can I believe that now?" she asked, with tears forming in her eyes. "Each gesture, each word, each moment I thought was genuine. How do I know it wasn't part of a plan to secure your inheritance?" James's expression revealed genuine pain, but Emily was too hurt to recognize it. "If you had really seen me as something more than a means to an end, you would have told me about this clause from the beginning," she continued, her voice breaking. "You would have given me the option to decide." "You're right," he conceded, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I should have told you, but when we married, we barely knew each other. And then things changed in a way I didn't expect." "I changed, Emily." He tried to take her hand, but she withdrew it abruptly. "I need to be alone," she declared, heading for the door. "I can't think clearly right now." "Emily, please," he called after her, with a note of desperation she had never heard in his voice. "We can talk about this, find a solution together." She stopped in the doorway, without turning around. "A solution?" she repeated bitterly. "You mean having a child to save your inheritance?" "I don't care about the inheritance," he responded vehemently. "I can start from scratch if necessary. What I don't want to lose is what we've built together." Emily turned to look at him one last time, with eyes bright from contained tears. "The problem, James, is that I no longer know what we've really built. And I don't know if I can trust what you say you feel for me." With those words, she left the library, leaving James alone with his whiskey and the weight of past decisions that now threatened to destroy the only truly valuable thing he had found in his life. The days following the revelation passed in a painful silence. Emily took refuge in her room, rejecting shared meals and James's attempts at conversation. He, for his part, respected her space but remained present, leaving small notes under her door, sincere apologies, explanations, and mainly reminders that his feelings were genuine, regardless of how everything had begun. One afternoon, while Emily was contemplating the garden from her window, Mrs. Wilson gently knocked on her door. "Excuse the intrusion, Mrs. Mitchell," said the woman when Emily allowed her to enter. "Mr. James has left for Chicago for a few days. He asked me to give you this." She extended a thick paper envelope, sealed with the Mitchell emblem. Emily took it with trembling hands, waiting for Mrs. Wilson to withdraw before opening it. Inside, she found a legal document and a brief handwritten note. "I instructed Thompson to draft this document. It's a formal renunciation of the will clause. I prefer to lose part of the inheritance than to lose you. It's not a strategy, Emily. It's my decision. Take the time you need. I'll be waiting." The document, signed by James and notarized, clearly established that he voluntarily renounced contesting the distribution of shares that would occur when the heir condition wasn't met, accepting the reduction of his participation in the Mitchell companies without presenting a legal battle. Emily sat slowly on the edge of the bed, with the document in her hands. It was a significant gesture, tangible proof that James was willing to sacrifice part of his empire for her. However, the wound of mistrust didn't close immediately. She spent the night awake, reflecting on the shared months, trying to separate the genuine from what might have been calculated. The next morning, she sought out Mrs. Wilson to ask questions she had never dared to formulate before. "What was James like before I arrived?" she asked directly, while they shared a coffee in the kitchen, a space in which Emily had frequently taken refuge during her first days at the estate. Mrs. Wilson observed her with wise eyes that had seen generations of Mitchells grow up. "He worked without rest," she responded after a reflective pause. "He would leave before dawn and return when everyone was asleep. He dined alone, always with documents on the table. On weekends, he would lock himself in the office or travel for meetings. I never saw him smile, not like he does now when he's with you." Emily assimilated this information in silence, remembering the distant man she had met at the altar. "Do you think he married me just for the will?" she finally asked, needing the perspective of someone who knew James better than she did herself. Mrs. Wilson gently shook her head. "Mr. Arthur, his father, left him many burdens, many expectations," she explained with a certain sadness. "Mr. James learned to do what was necessary to maintain the family legacy. But what happened between you two," she made a significant pause, "is something that wasn't in any plan or legal document. I've seen him change, Mrs. Mitchell. He's become again the boy I knew before his father's harshness transformed him." That conversation planted a seed of doubt in the certainty of Emily's pain. She began to recall specific moments, the expression of genuine surprise on James's face when she shared an unexpected thought, how he had gradually begun to adjust his schedule to spend more time with her, the vulnerability in his eyes during that stormy night. That afternoon she left her self-imposed isolation and explored the estate, rediscovering it with new eyes. In James's office, something caught her attention, a half-open drawer in the desk. Normally she wouldn't have invaded his privacy, but a corner of paper that appeared awakened her curiosity. What she found left her breathless, detailed architectural sketches for a transformation of the east wing of the estate. She recognized the space immediately. It was an art gallery with an adjoining studio, designed with perfect natural light for painting. In the margins, James's precise handwriting had noted, "For Emily, anniversary." The plans were dated 3 weeks earlier, long before the lawyer's call. It was a carefully thought-out project, designed specifically for her interests and passions, a gift that reflected true knowledge of who she was and what she loved. That night, when she finally retired to her room, Emily found herself unable to sleep. The day's revelations mixed with memories of moments shared with James, creating a confused mosaic of contradictory emotions. Near midnight, she made a decision. She needed space to think clearly. away from the influence of the estate and the memories that each corner evoked. The next morning, she informed Mrs. Wilson of her intention to visit her parents for a few days. The woman nodded understandingly, helping her prepare a small suitcase. "I'll inform Mr. James when he returns," she said simply. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Emily responded, with a voice more serene than it had been in days. "For everything." The return to the family home was like a journey through time. Her single bedroom remained practically intact, with the same books on the shelves and the same curtains she remembered. However, everything seemed smaller, more limited than in her memories. Or perhaps it was she who had changed, expanding beyond the confines of her old life. Her mother received her with barely disguised concern, though Emily tried to reassure her by explaining that she simply needed a rest. During those days, she observed her parents with new eyes, noting the subtle transformation in their lifestyle. New clothes, a recent car in the garage, comments about travel plans that would have been unthinkable before. All of this possible thanks to James's generosity, a generosity he had manifested discreetly, without boasting or seeking recognition. One afternoon, while helping her mother organize family photo albums, the conversation inevitably drifted to her marriage. "You don't seem unhappy, darling," her mother commented with the intuition that only mothers possess. "Different, yes. More mature, perhaps, but not unhappy." Emily smiled melancholically, running her fingers over a photograph from her childhood. "It's complicated, Mom," she responded honestly. "When I married James, I did it thinking it would be a sacrifice for the family. Then I discovered we could have a cordial, even pleasant coexistence. And then—" She stopped, unsure how to express the transformation their relationship had undergone. "Then you fell in love?" her mother completed with an understanding smile. Emily looked at her surprised, not so much by the question as by the revelation it contained. Had she fallen in love with James? The answer reached her heart before her mind. Yes, she had fallen in love with the complex, contradictory and surprisingly vulnerable man she had discovered beneath the facade of the relentless businessman. "I think so," she finally admitted, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders with this simple confession. "But there are complications, secrets he didn't share with me." Her mother took her hands in hers, with the wisdom of one who has navigated the complexities of love for decades. "Real love doesn't appear as in novels, Emily," she said softly. "It's not perfect from the beginning. It's built day by day, mistake after mistake, forgiveness after forgiveness. The question isn't whether there were secrets, but if what you've built together is worth continuing." Those words resonated with Emily during the following days. As she walked through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, visited old friends, and briefly resumed routines from her previous life, a certainty was crystallizing within her. Despite the pain and confusion, she deeply missed James. Not just the romantic moments or the deep conversations, but also the shared silences, the way his presence filled a space, even the small frictions that were part of discovering each other. A week after her departure, she made a decision. She wouldn't return immediately to the estate. She needed James to understand the depth of her pain and the importance of honesty in the relationship they were building. But she would write to him, opening a channel of communication that would allow them to begin rebuilding the fragmented trust. The letter she wrote that night was brief, but sincere. "James, the pain of feeling used initially eclipsed everything else. But these days away have allowed me to see more clearly. I cannot deny what has grown between us, something that goes far beyond any agreement or convenience. I still need time. I need to know I can trust that there will never again be important secrets between us, but I also want you to know that, despite the pain, what I feel for you is real. Emily." She sent the letter that same afternoon, feeling she had taken the first step on a path that could lead them back to each other, this time with more solid foundations than they had had until then. James's response came the next day, not in the form of a letter but in person. Emily was helping her mother in the garden when the doorbell rang. Upon opening the door, she found a James she barely recognized. He wore a beard of several days, casual clothes she had never seen him wear, and an expression of weariness that spoke of sleepless nights. "I'm not here to pressure you to return," he said immediately, as if he feared she might think that. "I just wanted to see you to make sure you're all right." There was such genuine vulnerability in his voice that Emily felt a lump in her throat. "I'm fine," she responded softly. Without inviting him in, but also without closing the door. "Your letter. It was a response to yours," he completed. "I wanted you to know that I respect your need for space and time. I haven't been handling your absence well, to be honest." The confession, so contrary to the image of absolute control that James usually projected, disarmed her. "You look tired," she commented, noticing the shadows under his eyes. A sad smile curved his lips. "It turns out I've grown accustomed to sleeping while listening to your breathing," he admitted. "The estate is unbearably silent without you." Emily felt her resolution weakening. Part of her wanted to invite him in, to pick up where they had left off, to pretend the wound didn't exist. But another part, the one that had matured significantly in recent months, knew they needed this time for reflection. "Would you like to walk a bit?" she offered as an alternative, pointing to the nearby park. "We could talk." James nodded, visibly relieved at not being completely rejected. They walked in silence at first, respecting the physical distance while shortening the emotional one. "I've been thinking a lot these days," Emily finally began. "About us, about how everything started, and what it has become." James listened with absolute attention, something he had learned to do in the months they had been together. "I understand why you didn't tell me about the clause at the beginning," she continued. "We barely knew each other. It was a practical arrangement for both of us. But later, when things changed between us—" "I should have told you," he completed, stopping to look at her directly. "The truth is, it ceased to matter. The will, the shares, all that. It took a back seat. And then, when Thompson called, it was as if two worlds I had kept separate collided." His honesty was palpable, and Emily felt that part of the tension she had carried in her shoulders began to dissipate. "What will happen with the companies?" she asked, genuinely concerned. "The renunciation you signed—" "It's legally binding," he confirmed. "Richard will receive that 30% of the shares when the deadline is met. I still have majority control, but I'll have to learn to work with him as a significant partner." "I'm sorry," Emily said sincerely. James gently shook his head. "Don't be. It's just money and power, Emily. I've recently discovered there are much more valuable things." They continued walking, this time in a more comfortable silence. When they reached a small artificial lake, where some children were throwing crumbs to the ducks, they sat on a bench under the shade of a century-old oak. "May I ask you something?" Emily said after a moment. "Anything you want," he responded with sincerity. "If that clause hadn't existed, would you have married me?" The question floated between them, loaded with implications. James reflected before responding, not to calculate his answer, but to honor the importance of the question. "Probably not," he finally admitted with an honesty that paradoxically began to restore the trust between them. "Not because you weren't absolutely deserving of being loved, but because I wasn't looking for love. I was completely focused on business, on maintaining the family legacy, on proving I could be as relentless as my father." He paused before continuing. "But that's the greatest irony of my life, Emily. What began as an obligation led me to the greatest gift I could have received, meeting you, discovering there's a life beyond contracts and acquisitions, learning to feel again." His words, devoid of the calculated perfection that usually characterized his business speeches, went directly to Emily's heart. There was a naked truth in them that no strategy could have fabricated. "I'm afraid," she confessed, looking at the lake, "of returning and resuming the roles we had before, of this crisis passing, and with it the honesty also vanishing." James took her hand with delicacy, the first physical contact they had shared in days. "I'm afraid too," he acknowledged, surprising her, "of not being enough, of not knowing how to be the man you deserve. I didn't have good examples of what love is, Emily. I'm learning as I go. But if you give me another chance, I promise there will be no more secrets between us." Emily observed their intertwined hands, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin. She didn't respond immediately, weighing not just his words, but the profound transformation they had both experienced since that day at the cathedral. "I need a little more time," she said finally. "Not to decide if I'll return, but to be sure I'm doing it for the right reasons. Not out of obligation, not out of habit, but because I truly choose to be with you." James nodded, gently squeezing her hand before releasing it. "All the time you need," he responded with a serenity that contrasted with the evident sadness in his eyes. "The estate is your home, Emily. It will be waiting. I will be waiting." They said goodbye with the promise to stay in touch, a farewell very different from the painful separation of days before. As she watched him walk away, Emily felt a growing certainty. What they had built, despite its imperfect beginnings, was something genuine and valuable, something worth fighting for. The following days passed in a strange reflective calm. Emily spent time with old friends, visited places from her childhood, and even briefly resumed painting classes at a local studio. But each experience came accompanied by a recurring thought: how she would like to share it with James, how his comments or perspectives would enrich the moment. One afternoon, while tidying her single bedroom, she found a scrapbook from her adolescence. Among its pages, she discovered her old sketches of her dream house: large windows, an art studio, lush gardens. With surprise, she recognized elements that, unknowingly, James had incorporated into those plans to remodel the east wing of the estate. It was as if somehow he had intuited her deepest desires. That night she made a decision. She was ready to return, not out of obligation, but by conscious choice. Not to pick up where they had left off, but to build something new, based on the honesty and mutual knowledge they had acquired through pain. The next morning, she called James for the first time since their separation. "I want to come back," she said simply when he answered, "not as your contract wife, but as your chosen partner." The silence on the other end of the line made her briefly fear the connection had been cut. "James?" she asked with concern. "I'm here," he responded with a voice loaded with emotion. "Just processing that this is real. When would you like me to come get you?" "It's not necessary," she responded with a new confidence. "I'll take a taxi. I want to make this journey by myself, as a symbol that I'm returning by my own decision." That afternoon, as the taxi passed through the gates of the estate, Emily felt she was returning transformed. She was no longer the insecure young woman who had arrived months ago as part of a convenient arrangement, but a woman who had learned the value of her own heart and the importance of demanding honesty in love. James was waiting for her at the entrance, not with a bouquet of flowers or grand gestures, but simply with eyes that didn't hide the emotion of seeing her again. When they embraced, it was as if something fit perfectly in the universe, a meeting of two people who had traveled separate paths to find each other at a completely new point. "Welcome home," he whispered against her hair. And for the first time since she had known him, Emily felt it truly was. November arrived in Connecticut with its characteristic mixture of dry days and cool nights. The Mitchell estate was experiencing a transformation that went beyond the seasonal decoration that Mrs. Wilson had carefully arranged in the main halls. It was a change in the atmosphere, in the energy that flowed through its centuries-old spaces. Emily's return marked the beginning of a new stage in her relationship with James. They didn't simply pick up where they had left off. They started anew, this time with foundations of honesty and conscious choice. The conversations they had previously avoided, about expectations, fears, deep desires, now formed part of their daily routine. One afternoon, while sharing tea in the rose garden, James surprised Emily with an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking," he began with that slightly tense expression she had learned to recognize as a sign that he was about to share something important. "About us. About our marriage." Emily looked at him attentively, giving him space to continue. "Legally, we are husband and wife," he continued. "But emotionally, what we have now is something completely different from what began in that ceremony. I was wondering if you would like to renew our vows." The proposal floated between them like a luminous promise. Emily felt her heart accelerate at the idea. "Renew our vows," she repeated, assimilating the concept. James nodded, taking her hand with a delicacy that contrasted with the strength everyone associated with him. "A small, intimate ceremony," he explained. "Just for us and those who really matter, without protocols or others' expectations. An opportunity to promise what we truly feel, not what a contract dictated." Emily felt her eyes moisten at the depth of the gesture. It wasn't a practical solution to a legal problem. It was a symbolic act of reinvention, of honoring the path they had traveled. "I would love that," she responded, with a smile that illuminated her face. "But with one condition." James looked at her with curiosity. "This time we'll write our own vows," she continued. "Words that reflect what we truly mean to each other, not pre-established formulas." The smile that formed on James's usually serious face completely transformed his features, revealing the man who existed beneath layers of responsibilities and expectations. "It's a deal," he responded, sealing the agreement with a kiss that contained both promise and celebration. The preparations for the intimate ceremony occupied the following weeks. They decided to hold it on New Year's Day as a symbol of new beginnings. There would be no more than 20 guests: Emily's parents, some close friends, the few true friends James had made over the years, and of course Mrs. Wilson and the estate staff, who had become family to both. In parallel, James surprised Emily by resuming the project to transform the East Wing. The architects and designers began to work discreetly, following the ideas she enthusiastically contributed. The space, which had once housed unused rooms, began to transform into a luminous art studio with a small adjoining gallery. "I want you to have a place that's completely yours," James explained when he showed her the progress. "A space where you can explore your passion for art without limitations." Emily toured the area under construction, excited by the possibilities opening before her. The large windows they had installed allowed natural light to flood the space, creating perfect conditions for painting. "It's more than I would have dreamed," she confessed, deeply moved. "It's just the beginning," he responded, observing her with a mixture of pride and adoration. "I was thinking you might consider resuming your art history studies if you're interested. Columbia has an excellent program." The proposal took her by surprise. In the months they had been together, Emily had shared many of her interrupted dreams, but she hadn't expected James to have registered them with such attention. "Study formally?" she asked, considering the idea for the first time in years. "Why not?" he responded naturally. "You have the talent and the passion. Age should never be an obstacle to pursuing what we truly desire." Those words resonated deeply with Emily. For years, she had filed away her personal aspirations, first due to her family's economic difficulties, then to adapt to her new role as James Mitchell's wife. The idea of actively resuming her dreams, of building an identity that was complementary but independent of her marriage, was as terrifying as it was exciting. "I'll think seriously about it," she promised, feeling a path full of possibilities opening before her. As the end of the year approached, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. James began to involve Emily in aspects of his business that he had previously kept completely separate from his domestic life. To her surprise, she discovered she possessed a natural instinct for finance and a fresh perspective that added value to his decisions. "You should consider a line of investment in contemporary art," Emily suggested one night, while they reviewed some projects together. "Not just as philanthropy, but as a long-term strategy. American talent is gaining increasing international recognition." James observed her with renewed respect, appreciating not just the intuition behind the suggestion, but also the confidence with which she expressed it. "It's an excellent idea," he responded sincerely. "Would you like to develop it? We could establish a separate foundation focused on supporting emerging artists." The proposal crystallized in the following weeks: the Mitchell Foundation for the Arts, a project that combined James's business vision with Emily's artistic sensibility. For the first time, they were building something together, as true partners. New Year's Eve arrived with a perfect clarity that allowed them to see the stars from the central courtyard of the estate, where they had decided to hold the ceremony. Lanterns and soft lights created a magical atmosphere among the magnolias and maple trees. A small string ensemble played softly while the few guests took their places. Emily had chosen a simple but elegant dress, a deep blue that contrasted with the protocol white of her first wedding. James, for his part, had opted for a light suit, so different from the dark ones he usually wore for business. When they met before the judge who would officiate the symbolic ceremony, there was no nervousness or doubt, just the tranquil certainty of two people who had consciously chosen to be together. "When we met," James began his vows, with a voice that conveyed contained emotion, "we were two strangers, united by circumstances and conveniences. Today we are here because we have chosen to build something real and true. You taught me, Emily, that life is much more than achievements and possessions. You showed me that true wealth is in shared moments, in honesty, in the vulnerability that allows us to truly connect. I promise you today that each day I will try to be worthy of the gift that is your love. I promise you honesty, respect, and the freedom for you to continue growing and transforming. I promise to be by your side, not as the man I was, but as the man you inspire me to be." Silent tears rolled down Emily's cheeks as she listened to words that reflected a shared journey that no one else could completely understand. When her turn came, her voice conveyed a serenity that contrasted with the visible emotion in her eyes. "James, I came to this house as part of an agreement, with fear and resignation in my heart," she began, holding his hands firmly. "Today I return to it by choice, with love and hope. In these months we've learned that true love isn't an instantaneous feeling, but a daily construction, made of small gestures, of forgiveness, of shared growth. I promise you today to be your companion in every sense, in moments of joy and in challenges, in fulfilled dreams and in those we still pursue. I promise you honesty in my words and in my silences. I promise you the constant effort to build together a home where we can both authentically be who we are. And above all, I promise to remind you each day that you are much more than your surname or your achievements. You are a man with an extraordinary heart who deserves to be fully loved." The exchange of rings, simple without ostentation, sealed promises that were born not from obligation but from mutual recognition. When the judge declared them once more husband and wife, the kiss they shared wasn't the protocol one from their first ceremony, but one loaded with everything they had lived and overcome together. The celebration that followed was intimate and warm, so different from the formal reception of their original wedding. There was dancing, laughter, shared stories, and wishes for the year that was beginning. Emily's parents, who at first had feared for their daughter's happiness in an arranged marriage, now observed with relief and joy the evident transformation in the couple. Late into the night, when most of the guests had left, James and Emily found themselves alone in the garden, under the same starry sky that had witnessed their vow renewal. "Are you happy?" he asked, with a vulnerability he only allowed himself to show before her. Emily looked at him, taking a moment to assimilate the path they had traveled and what still lay ahead. "I am happy," she responded with absolute sincerity, not with a perfect fairy tale happiness, but with a real happiness, built on truths and overcomings, and that makes it much more valuable. James smiled, intertwining his fingers with hers as they contemplated together the beginning of a new year and a new stage in their shared history. Spring arrived in Connecticut with an explosion of colors that transformed the estate's gardens into a living spectacle. For Emily and James, the month since their vow renewal had been marked by constant growth, both individual and in their relationship. The art studio in the East Wing had finally been completed, and Emily spent a large part of her mornings there, rediscovering a passion that had remained dormant for years. Her canvases began to populate not just the studio but also other spaces of the estate, bringing color and life to places that had previously remained austerely decorated. In parallel, she had begun her formal studies in art history, dividing her time between the university and the projects of the newly created Mitchell Foundation for the Arts, which was quickly gaining recognition in New York's cultural sphere. James, for his part, had implemented significant changes in his professional life. He delegated responsibilities he had previously assumed personally, reorganized his schedule to return home at reasonable hours, and even began to take entire weekends free of work commitments. The relentless businessman who worked without rest was learning the value of balance. One afternoon in May, while sharing a late lunch on the terrace, Emily noticed that James seemed unusually thoughtful. "Has something happened?" she asked, recognizing the small gestures that indicated concern in him. James set his water glass on the table, carefully considering his words. "I received news from Thompson this morning," he began, referring to his lawyer. "The deadline in the will has been met." Emily felt a knot in her stomach. Although they had talked extensively about the topic, and James had made his position clear, the reminder of that clause that had almost destroyed their relationship was uncomfortable. "And," she asked, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "Officially, Richard has received his share of the stocks," James continued. 30%, as stipulated in the will. She nodded, processing the information. Although James had signed the renunciation to contest the distribution months ago, the formal implementation represented a significant change in the control of Mitchell Companies. "How do you feel about it?" she asked, genuinely interested in his emotional reaction, not just the practical implications. James looked at her with an expression that surprised her. There was no regret or bitterness, but a serenity that contrasted with the James of months ago. "Liberated," he responded sincerely. "It's as if I had paid a pending debt to my father and now could really move forward." Emily extended her hand across the table, intertwining her fingers with his in a gesture of silent support. "Richard came to see me after the shareholders' meeting," James continued. "I expected to find resentment or at least coldness. Instead, he proposed a collaboration to expand the international division. He has interesting ideas, perspectives we hadn't considered. Will you work with him?" Emily asked, surprised by this unexpected turn. James nodded, with a smile that reflected his own surprise at the situation. "I think it could work. He's intelligent, hungry to prove his worth, and honestly, it frees me from some responsibilities I never really enjoyed." This revelation provoked a wave of pride in Emily. The James she had initially known would have seen any cession of control as a personal defeat. The man before her now saw opportunities where before he would have only perceived threats. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, with a sincerity that illuminated her gaze. James gently squeezed her hand, visibly moved by the recognition. "I've been thinking," he continued, slightly changing the subject, "about the future, about what I really want to do with my life." Emily looked at him with curiosity. It was rare for James to speak in such open terms about future possibilities. Generally, his plans were concrete and detailed. "The companies are stable, with a solid management team," he explained. "With Richard assuming part of the international responsibilities, I'll have more time available. And I was wondering—" He stopped, as if gathering courage to express something important. "Yes?" she gently encouraged him. "I was wondering if you'd like us to travel for a while," he finally completed. "Not a brief vacation, but an extended stay. Europe, perhaps. You could visit all those museums you know in theory, but have never experienced personally. I could explore other passions." The proposal was as unexpected as it was exciting. Emily tried to imagine James Mitchell, the businessman who had once defined vacations as wasted days, contemplating a prolonged trip without a strict agenda. "What passions would you explore?" she asked, genuinely intrigued. An almost shy expression, so uncharacteristic of him, crossed his face. "Architecture," he admitted, like someone confessing a long-kept secret. "I'd like to study the great European works up close, maybe even take some courses. It's an interest I never could develop." Emily felt her heart expand at this confession. It was the culmination of a long process of transformation, James finally allowing himself to recognize and pursue his own dreams, not those imposed by the family legacy. "I would love that," she responded with genuine enthusiasm. "I could even transfer some university credits. And the foundation can be managed partially from a distance." The smile that illuminated James's face conveyed a relief and joy he rarely showed so openly. "I had thought of leaving in September," he added, revealing that the idea had been carefully considered. "Starting with England, then France, Italy, following whatever pace seems right to us." As they discussed possibilities and destinations, Emily observed the man before her with a mixture of love and amazement. Who would have imagined that day at the cathedral that the distant and pragmatic James Mitchell would now be planning a trip to rediscover himself? The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic, but a gradual process of opening and vulnerability, nurtured by the mutual trust they had built. That night, as they walked through the gardens under a starry sky, the conversation drifted to a topic they had only tangentially addressed since the crisis provoked by the will clause. "Emily," James began with a voice softer than usual, "there's something I want to ask, and I want you to know there's no pressure or hidden expectations." She looked at him attentively, noting the seriousness in his expression. "Have you thought about having children?" he finally asked. "Not because of testamentary obligation or to continue a surname, but because you truly desire it." The question, formulated with such care and respect, touched on a reflection Emily had been developing internally for months. "I have been thinking about it," she admitted, appreciating the honesty of the conversation. "Before, the idea of having a child as part of an agreement terrified me. But now—" "Now?" he gently encouraged her when she paused. Now I find myself imagining what it would be like to raise a child together, she completed with a shy smile. Teaching them to appreciate art, seeing how you would show them to build things. I like that image. James stopped, taking her hands in his with a moving delicacy. I like that image too, he confessed, but I want it to be a decision completely yours, completely ours. No deadlines, no external pressures. Emily felt her eyes moisten at the depth of the respect contained in those words. Perhaps after our trip, she suggested, when we've both explored more parts of ourselves, when we're ready to share not just our lives, but also our discoveries with someone else. James nodded, drawing her into an embrace that communicated more than any words. They remained that way for a long moment, connected not just physically, but in a shared vision of the future they wanted to build together. As they returned to the house, softly illuminated in the distance, Emily reflected on the extraordinary journey they had undertaken, from a marriage of convenience to a genuine partnership based on love, respect, and mutual growth. It hadn't been an easy or direct path, but a crossing full of obstacles, misunderstandings, and reconciliations. But precisely these challenges had forged something infinitely more valuable than the initial agreement that had united them. Summer in Connecticut arrived with its characteristic intense heat, transforming the estate into a refuge of cool shadows and patios perfumed by the magnolias in full bloom. For Emily and James, the months passed in a balanced mixture of individual projects and shared plans. The Mitchell Foundation for the Arts inaugurated its first formal exhibition, presenting the work of 10 emerging New York artists in a gallery in Soho. The event, which was attended by prominent figures from the cultural and business spheres, represented the materialization of a vision that perfectly combined the strengths of both, Emily's artistic eye and James's organizational capacity. I never imagined I would be so nervous about an art exhibition, James confessed, as they received guests on the opening night. Emily observed him with a mixture of pride and tenderness. Dressed in a dark blue suit that contrasted with the terracotta dress she had chosen, James projected his usual image of confidence. Only she could recognize the small gestures that revealed his anxiety, the way he discreetly adjusted his tie, the slight movement of his right foot. "It's different when the result really matters, isn't it?" she commented, momentarily intertwining her fingers with his. "It's not just another business." James nodded, perfectly understanding what she meant. In recent months, he had experienced a revelation: the fundamental difference between pursuing externally imposed goals and those born from authentic passions. The foundation, although managed with the same efficiency that characterized all his endeavors, awakened in him a completely new type of satisfaction. The exhibition was a resounding success. The local press highlighted not just the quality of the presented works, but also the innovative vision of the Mitchell Foundation, which combined support for new talents with educational programs for communities with limited access to art. "This is just the beginning," James commented as they returned to the estate that night, with the satisfied weariness of someone who has seen a shared dream materialize. "I was thinking we could expand the educational program to rural areas when we return from our trip." Emily smiled at the naturalness with which he now spoke of our trip and when we return, as if the idea of temporarily pausing the frantic rhythm of business had become completely normal for him. "I would love that," she responded, imagining the possibilities. "Art can be a powerful tool for social transformation." As August advanced, the preparations for their trip intensified. They had decided to begin in London, where Emily could visit her friend Jessica while they acclimated to European life. From there, they would follow a route that combined the great cultural capitals with smaller, less touristy towns, seeking a balance between the art that passionate Emily and the architecture that James yearned to study. One afternoon, while reviewing itineraries in the library now converted into their shared planning space, James received a call that would significantly transform their plans. "That was the Dean of Architecture at University College London," he explained with a mixture of incredulity and enthusiasm as he hung up. "They've offered me a place in a special program for professionals who want to formalize their knowledge in the field. Apparently, an industry colleague recommended me when I mentioned my interest." Emily set aside the maps she was consulting, genuinely excited by the news. "James, that's wonderful," she exclaimed, recognizing the magnitude of the opportunity. It's exactly what you had mentioned you'd like to explore. He nodded, though with a slightly conflicted expression. The program begins in October and lasts a full semester, he continued, revealing the cause of his ambivalence. It would mean establishing ourselves in London for at least 6 months, instead of following the itinerary we had planned. Emily approached, taking his hands in hers. It's an extraordinary opportunity, she responded without hesitation. We can adapt our plans. London will be our base, and we'll explore Europe from there. Besides, she added with a complicit smile, I always dreamed of living temporarily in a European city. The gratitude in James's eyes was palpable. Despite the months of transformation, he still found it surprising to find in Emily such unconditional support for his personal aspirations. Are you sure? He asked, wanting to confirm she wasn't sacrificing her own desires. Completely, she affirmed with conviction. Besides, University College London has an excellent art history department. I could take some courses as a visiting student while you study architecture. Thus, their plans were reconfigured around this new opportunity. They would rent an apartment in central London, a neighborhood that perfectly combined James's architectural interest with the cultural environment Emily appreciated. They would dedicate weekends and free periods to exploring other regions of England and nearby countries. As their departure, now scheduled for the end of September, approached, James occupied himself with reorganizing responsibilities in the Mitchell companies. To the surprise of many in New York's business circle, he announced that Richard would temporarily assume the general direction with the support of a carefully selected executive team. Are you sure about this? Emily asked one night, conscious of what it meant for James to delegate control of the companies that had defined his identity for so long. He looked at her with a serenity that reflected his personal evolution. A year ago, the idea of being away for 6 months would have seemed unthinkable to me, he admitted. But now I see things from another perspective. The companies will still be there when we return, probably stronger thanks to new ideas. And I need this time to rediscover parts of myself that I sacrificed for too many years. Emily felt a wave of love and admiration at this confession. The path they had traveled together had transformed them both in ways they never would have imagined when they pronounced those formal vows in the cathedral. The last week before their departure was marked by a series of goodbyes. A dinner with Emily's parents, who saw with joy the evident happiness of their daughter, a meeting with the foundation team to establish guidelines during their absence, and finally, a quiet afternoon with Mrs. Wilson, who had been a silent witness to all their evolution. The house will feel empty without you, the woman commented as they shared a coffee in the kitchen, the space where the first true connection between Emily and the estate had begun. We'll be back before you know it, Emily responded with affection, and we'll write regularly. Mrs. Wilson nodded, with a look that contained much more than her words expressed. I've never seen Mr. James so happy, so at peace with himself, she commented, with the frankness that only years of loyal service permitted her. That's your doing, Mrs. Mitchell. She gently shook her head. It's the work of both of us, Mrs. Wilson, she corrected softly. Of brave decisions, honest conversations, and second chances. The night before their departure, James surprised Emily with a special dinner in the Rose Garden, the place where they had had their first real conversation so many months ago. Under a starry sky and surrounded by the perfume of flowers, they shared memories of their extraordinary journey together and dreams for the adventure they were about to begin. There's something I want to give you, James said after dinner, extracting a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Emily opened it with curiosity, finding a delicate gold ring with a blue stone that caught the candlelight. It's beautiful, she murmured, admiring the jewel. It was my mother's, James explained with a soft voice. My father kept it all these years, and I found it among his belongings after his death. I never found the right moment to use it until now. Emily looked at him with contained emotion, understanding the profound meaning of the gesture. It represents not just our shared past, but also our future, he continued, taking the ring and gently sliding it onto her finger. A future we'll build together step by step, discovery after discovery. I'll always treasure it, she responded, deeply moved by the symbolism of the gift. That night, as the estate slept under the starry mantle of the Connecticut sky, Emily and James remained awake until the early hours, sharing not just physical intimacy, but also the dreams, fears, and hopes they harbored for this new stage. It wasn't just a geographical journey they were about to undertake, but a deeper exploration of themselves and what they could build together when love and mutual respect guided the way. When sleep finally claimed them, they did so intertwined, with the tranquil certainty that regardless of the destinations they would visit or the experiences they would live, they had already made their greatest discovery: true love that flourishes not when it's imposed or expected, but when it's patiently cultivated through honesty, forgiveness, and the will to grow together. 2 years later, the golden light of late afternoon filtered through the windows of Emily's studio, bathing the space in a warm glow that seemed to caress every surface. The half-finished canvases, the framed photographs of European cities, the art books stacked on dark wooden shelves, and the small travel souvenirs strategically dispersed created an environment that perfectly reflected the evolution of its owner. Emily thoughtfully observed the New York skyline from her favorite window, with a cup of tea between her hands and a serene expression that spoke of a deep and established happiness. The months in London had extended to almost a full year, a time of discoveries, growth, and solidification of the foundations they had built together. The sound of familiar footsteps interrupted her contemplation. James appeared in the doorway of the studio, with a relaxed expression that markedly contrasted with the perpetual tension that had characterized the man she had met years ago. He was dressed casually, with a light sweater and comfortable pants, another visible transformation of the businessman who had once seemed inseparable from his formal suits. "Here you are," he said with a smile, approaching to kiss her softly. "Mrs. Wilson says dinner will be ready in half an hour." "I lost track of time," she confessed, pointing to the canvas she had been working on, an urban landscape of London that masterfully captured the characteristic light of the Thames city. James observed the painting with a critical eye, genuine appreciation he had developed during their time in Europe. "It's extraordinary," he commented sincerely. "You've perfectly captured the essence of the place." Emily smiled, recognizing the evolution in his aesthetic appreciation. The architecture program had not only provided him with technical knowledge, but also a renewed sensitivity towards the visual arts that deeply enriched their connection. "How was the meeting with the foundation?" she asked, remembering he had spent the afternoon in the offices of the project that had now significantly expanded. "Inspiring," he responded, sitting on the edge of the window across from her. "The rural program has exceeded all our expectations. The teachers report significant changes in the children's participation and expression." The satisfaction in his voice was evident. After their return from Europe, James had reorganized his professional priorities. Although he maintained an active role in the Mitchell companies, he dedicated a substantial portion of his time and energy to the foundation and to selected architectural projects that combined his newly formalized expertise with social purposes. "Did you hear from the gallery?" he asked in turn, referring to the solo exhibition Emily was preparing, the culmination of her work during and after their stay in Europe. She nodded, with a gleam of excitement in her eyes. "They confirmed the date for October," she responded, "and the catalogue will be ready next week for final review." The pride in James's gaze was unequivocal. During their time in London, Emily had not only completed advanced courses in art history, but had also significantly developed her own creative work, finding a unique voice that combined traditional American elements with contemporary European influences. Her return to New York had been accompanied by a growing recognition in the local artistic sphere, now crowned with this solo exhibition in one of the city's most prestigious galleries. A soft cry interrupted their conversation, coming from the baby monitor discreetly placed on a side table. Both smiled upon hearing it. "It seems someone has woken up from their nap," Emily commented, setting her cup on the table. "I'll go," James offered, rising with the naturalness of someone who has completely incorporated this new role into his identity. Minutes later, he returned with a small figure in his arms. Lily, 10 months old, with dark eyes like her father's and her mother's luminous smile. The baby, just awake but already alert, immediately extended her arms toward Emily upon seeing her. "Come here, my love," she said, taking her in her arms and kissing her chubby cheeks. "Did you have sweet dreams?" Lily babbled animatedly, as if trying to share the wonders discovered in her dream world. James observed them with an expression that contained all the love in the universe, still marveling at the perfection of the small being they had created together. The decision to form a family had come naturally after their return from Europe, not as fulfillment of a forgotten testamentary obligation, but as the logical continuation of the love they had built. Lily had been born exactly 3 years after their original wedding, a coincidence that sometimes made them laugh at the irony of fate. "I was thinking of taking her to the garden for a while before dinner," James commented, gently caressing his daughter's head. "The maple trees are especially beautiful this afternoon." Emily nodded, handing the little one back to him, who contentedly settled in her father's arms. The image of James Mitchell, once New York's most feared businessman, holding his daughter with infinite tenderness while showing her the garden flowers, contained all the magnitude of the transformation they had lived. "I'll join you in a moment," she promised, indicating she wanted to put away her painting materials. When she was alone again in the studio, Emily contemplated the space that so perfectly represented her personal evolution. From the insecure young woman who had arrived at this estate as part of a convenient arrangement, to the confident and fulfilled woman who now combined multiple facets: artist, scholar, wife, mother, foundation director. Her gaze stopped on a framed photograph on her desk, she and James in front of Big Ben in London, both smiling and relaxed, with the majestic clock tower as a backdrop. It had been taken during their first month in England, when everything was new and exciting, when they were just beginning to glimpse the possibilities that were opening before them. Next to that image, a more recent one, the three of them in the estate garden, newborn Lily in Emily's arms, James protectively surrounding them, happiness evident in every line of their faces. 2 moments that marked milestones in an extraordinary journey. A journey that had begun with a yes pronounced out of obligation and convenience, and that had transformed into a story of authentic love, built day by day through honest conversations, brave decisions, and the shared will to grow together. Emily carefully stored her brushes, covered the canvas in progress, and turned off the studio lights. As she walked out to the corridor leading to the garden, she could hear James's voice patiently explaining to Lily the names of the flowers, as if the little one could understand them. The scene, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, seemed extracted from a dream she had never dared to dream. She joined them in silence, forming a perfect circle when James extended his free arm to include her in the embrace. Lily happily cooed upon seeing her small family reunited, extending her chubby little hands to touch her mother's face. "Do you know what day it is today?" James asked softly, as the three contemplated the spectacle of the setting sun over the gardens. Emily smiled, because of course she knew. "The anniversary of our first encounter in this same garden," she responded, remembering that day when he had found her crying over her friend's letter, the first moment they had genuinely connected. James nodded, gently kissing her temple. "The day when everything truly began," he confirmed. "The day I began to see beyond the agreement, beyond the obligations. The day I began to see you, Emily, not just my contract wife." She rested her head on his shoulder, observing how their daughter played with a rose petal that James had picked for her. "If you could go back," she asked with curiosity, not with insecurity, "would you change anything about how we began?" James reflected for a moment, with the seriousness that characterized his important considerations. "Not a single detail," he finally responded. "Each misunderstanding, each pain, each reconciliation, everything brought us exactly here, and I wouldn't trade this here for anything in the world." Lily, as if understanding the depth of the moment, let out a crystalline laugh that resonated in the garden, drawing the loving gazes of her parents. "Sometimes," Emily reflected, observing her daughter, "the most beautiful endings are born from the most improbable beginnings. All it takes is the courage to transform what is into what could be." James nodded, gently tightening the embrace that united the three of them, "and the patience to build, day by day, the love we deserve," he completed. As the sun completed its descent, bathing the garden in purple and golden tones, the Mitchell family remained united in that perfect circle, a living symbol of a universal truth, that sometimes the most practical arrangements can transform into the most extraordinary love stories when two hearts decide, against all odds, to truly find each other. Because true love is not that which appears instantly like lightning, but that which is patiently cultivated like a garden, blooming more beautifully with each shared season.